Hi, Avinash. Welcome. Just we're waiting for 2-3 minutes and we should be ready to start. So thanks for joining us today. And just to give a brief, I'll go over just about us and about you as an introduction. And then the floor is all yours. So as we've discussed, so I think we should have a very interesting session. I can see people joining in. So thanks.
Okay.
Just a request for everyone, please. I know by default everyone is muted at our end, other than the speaker, which I'll also go in the mute mode after I'm done, just to not cause any disturbance for the speaker. So if you're not muted, just please mute yourself. Thank you. In a minute, I think we should be good to go. So just give us a minute, please. Thank you. And we do hope everyone is safe, especially in India, however, because we know the cases are rising. So hope you and your loved ones are safe and well wherever you are. So please do take care, because at least in Delhi, we do have the cases spiking up tremendously currently. So please take care. I think, Avinash, we can start. So it's 11. Everyone can join in as we go. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the new session of Fireside Chats of Asian Pathfinders. I'm Pallavi. I'll be your host. My colleague Shreyas is also joining us today. So he'll be the co-host, and any issues, please reach out to us on the chat, because the other features are disabled. But definitely we want it to be an engaging session. So do reach out through the chat session if you have any issues. So just to give us a brief about us, we started with the whole idea of having a platform where practitioners, scholars, academics can come together to have a constructive dialogue. So more focused on Asian region, but definitely because we are an interconnected world, all different topics are welcome. We are an open knowledge sharing forum. So anyone who does have an idea, is researching on something, is working on a topic or topics that they think very strongly about, feel really strongly about, please do come here. If you want to figure out some collaborations, definitely do reach out to us, because we do have few people who are always looking out to collaborate with others. Okay, sorry, I think, okay, sorry about that. So like I said, guiding principles is we want to keep it as a constructive dialogue forum, bring different people, different views together, and just that have a research collaboration. We hold these weekly chats on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Where we want to create a knowledge repository of different topics. So we go from geopolitics to climate change to today, the Chinese Communist Party. Next week, we have someone speaking on the CPCE, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and the whole implication, the Chinese role in the region. So please definitely join us. We have topics like politics and women in South Asia coming up later. We have few multiple different topics to give us that different kind of knowledge repository. These are just a few topics that could be just a guiding principle if you're looking to participate with us. So these are just the top few topics. Definitely there are others if you think really strongly about and you think that can be something that people want to hear, definitely reach out to us. Just guidelines, I've also posted the same in the chat, but respect the views of others. We are here to have a dialogue, but do express yourselves. Please don't hold back. There are no thing as stupid questions, one of my professors used to say, and he encouraged us to speak. So that stayed with me and with all of us. So we definitely say that. Respect the purpose of this community. We are here to come together from different walks of life, different areas of research to work together. Respect intellectual property. Our experts who come here do work really hard on their presentation and on their research. So definitely respect the ideas that they express here. and definitely seek their permission from the speaker before you use their content to quote anything or attribute. So, but you can attribute, you can quote, but definitely seek their permission before you do that. And I think it goes without saying, do not post defamatory, abusive content. Uh, Stick to the topic at hand that we have on each sessions. Today is Chinese Communist Party. I know we all have different views, but definitely let's hear the speaker here. And that's contact us. So about the talk today, the Chinese Communist Party, ambitions, ability, and ambiguity. So I'll not speak a lot about CCP because we have an expert in house. But definitely, if you have studied China or observed China a little bit or have an understanding, China is a one-party system. It's the ruling party, CCP, and it does drive the ambitions of China on the global stage, but also is the driving force behind a lot of developments in China. And Avinash will be speaking on the CCP's messaging since the 19th Party Congress of 2017, and also how in the current situation, COVID-19 has affected this messaging. So just to give you about Avinash, Dr. Avinash Godbole is an assistant professor of IR and China Studies at Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities at the Jindal Global University, which has come up as one of the top universities in India, especially in the realm of social sciences in the recent years. His focus is on China's foreign policy and Asia strategy. The party studies, one of the topics for today, and China's minority policies, energy and environment policies. He has widely published in academic and media circles, and he has previously worked with the Indian Council of World Affairs and the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense and Security Studies, and he's also a visiting faculty at the Naval War College, Goa. So I'll not take much of your time, Avinash. I'll hand it over to you. So yeah.
Thank you. So let me begin by thanking the group for inviting me to speak in front of such an important audience. Let me ask, is my audio level all right for Pallavi, everyone else?
Perfect, it's all good.
Okay. Let me confess that I don't have a PowerPoint for the talk today. When I agreed for the talk, I was on schedule to complete my paper grading on about Tuesday, and then I thought I'll prepare a decent PowerPoint for this talk. But you all know what all happened in the last 72 hours or slightly more, and that has actually diverted and distracted a lot of our attention. So please accept my apology for not having a structured PowerPoint. I'm going to be speaking today out of a paper that is in the process of publication. It's a long paper, about 10,000 words, on what is happening in the party and what are the directions of the party. Also, while discussing with Shreyas, I thought that in order to understand present situation, instead of looking at what is happening right now, it's better to take a long view of how the party has come to where it has and how it has guided its own identity and ideology in the last few years, especially under the leadership of Xi Jinping, whom we believe is an exceptionally different leader when compared to his predecessors in various ways. So let me begin. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a brief overview of the history of the party, actually, and then I'll come to the messaging since the October 2017 19th Party Congress. We all know that Chinese Communist Party celebrates its 100-year anniversary next year. It has had a long history. That history goes back to the Sun Yat-sen regime, their cooperation with the nationalist government, the betrayal, the fight with the Japanese, then the liberation and the Mao era. But that is not the period when China's power achievement begins. China begins to achieve its power actually from 1977, the process of 4 modernizations. And that is something that we have not studied a lot in our country. And that is something actually we also need to understand when we have repeated messaging like ban China. we have to understand what are the sources of China's power actually today, and what can we do for our country in a similar vein. So China began this process of four modernizations in 1977 in his documents, in his policy statements. The actual process began in 1980 when the agricultural modernization began. That was the first step of modernization that they began with, liberation of agricultural practices, semi-privatization, farmer being able to control a part of what they produce and then selling to the government another part for a profit. That was the time when China began with that slogan, if you all remember, that it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it's catching the mice. And that was a method that China used for becoming what it is today. That's why it moved away without any doubt from a communist country to a country of socialist market economy. The second modernization was industrial modernization, late 1980s and 1990s, when the reforms process began. The third was science and technology, research, innovation, industry, academia, integration. Really, a lot of funding on scientific innovation and research, etc., began in that phase. The fourth being the defense modernization. One of the first steps, some of you might recall, was the one-child policy process that began in the 1980s. The second important step was the establishment of the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, which is right next to Hong Kong. Shenzhen has actually been leading China's economic growth for so many years, right from 1980 onwards. And it's going to lead China's next level of economic growth also, something that I'll come to towards the end of the talk. Then next came the shock of 1989, the Tiananmen Square developments. And I'm not going to go to the details of that, but that gave the Chinese Communist Party one of the significant lessons on how it should operate. And that is summarized in just single word: stability. Stability remains one of the core concerns of the CCP, and it aims to achieve stability at any cost, to keep itself at the center of the process, and to be able to rule by presenting a unified face, by presenting a single narrative across the leadership, across states, and across the central party as well. So for ensuring stability, what do they need to do? They need to achieve three things. First, prevent a large-scale protest of the scale of 1989, or even smaller for that matter. Second, avoid public leadership splits. Discuss whatever you want to in internal communication. Criticize the party. That happens a lot. A lot of internal communication is where leadership gets criticized. And third, being keeping the military loyal to the party. It's important to remember that in China, the People's Liberation Army is not a government's army. It's not the Chinese army, but it's an army of the party. And that has been the case right since the days since the struggle between the Chinese Communist Party and nationalists began in the 1920s. So keeping the army loyal to the party is one of the significant things that the party wants to achieve. And that these three goals that they have pursued quite significantly since 1989. 1992 was the first major peaceful power transition in China, when Deng Xiaoping stepped away, gave away step by step his authority to the next generation. And that time, the legitimacy of the party also changed. How do you reconcile the fact that a party that is still a communist party advances the market economy and begins to say that in the process of growth, some people will get rich and some people will some people will get rich first and others will have to follow them through hard work or other methods. When that happens, the party's messaging changes. The party's relations with the people change. And at that time, the party in 1992-93 began the first step of academic content rewriting. So at that time, the idea that China was humiliated by Japanese aggression for a period of about 100 years came back, into the formal discourse. And that history and that humiliation uh, and the war crimes of Japan, the Nanjing massacre, the Korean incidents, etc., the French and the British, Dutch uh, concessionaires, and other aggressions in South China began to be recalled. So Chinese Communist Party began this narrative that China was humiliated by external aggressors at some point in time. Uh, and it is the Chinese Communist Party's rise that has rather hard work of the Chinese Communist Party and all its leaders, including Mao Zedong, that have given the power to China. So Chinese always argue that China is not rising, but they are re-rising after the century of humiliation and the hard work put in by the first couple of generations. So that nationalism process begins in 1990s. And that is why uh, the greater push to reintegrate Hong Kong, to reintegrate Taiwan, to assimilate Hong Kong in a very specific way, etc. Uh, Mid 1990s, China began to start exporting things after the second stage of industrial reforms. After that, science and technology reforms start giving China things like high-speed railways, innovation, etc. Uh, and after that, we are seeing the phase of defense reforms. So I'm trying to argue that we have still not seen the complete reforms process in China. Obviously, defense reform will be an ongoing process. That is still an ongoing process. And the Chinese Communist Party uh, is trying to achieve all these reforms and gain power and legitimacy amongst its people at all the time in in uh, in different ways. Now, if you were to look at the Chinese Communist Party since the 19th Party Congress, they have been governed under what is now called the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. It's a long phrase, but that is how the messaging works. The central leadership,
Like that.
the leadership's keywords come right at the top of the process, and then the rest of the things follow in the messaging process. One of the significant things that changed was that the Communist Party always operates on the basis of something called a principal contradiction. In 1981, the principal contradiction was modified at that time. And then at that time, I'm quoting, the principal contradiction said that the contradiction was between the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people and the backward social production. In simple terms, it means that you have to advance your economic strategies, you have to bring material well-being for the people, and that is something that is missing from the Chinese life. In the 19th Party Congress, the redefined principal contradiction said, and I quote, and bear with me for this slightly longish quote, "What we now face is a contradiction between unbalanced and inadequate development and people's ever-growing needs for a better life." At that time, Xi Jinping also spoke at this point while speaking on this issue that it is changing the way people relate to party has been changing, and that is what something a party has to be conscious of and to be able to respond to. So the new principal contradiction in a nutshell means that we have achieved economic growth of some form, but there are quality of life issues. So first quality of life issues is corruption at a local level, something that they have acted upon in many years in the last in many years actually. It's a process that started with the Hu Jintao regime when they began to say that corruption can become an existential crisis of the party. It was one of the Xi Jinping, it was one of the Hu Jintao regime's reports that led to the anti-corruption drive actually to begin. And Xi Jinping has only carried forward that process. Second contradiction, quality of life issue is pollution in China. We all have seen that. Third is unequal development between coastal provinces and the interiors of China. Fourth is the income inequality between the rich and the poor. And the fifth is minority provinces and the rest of the country, the inequality of that sort. So the Chinese Communist Party is trying to address uh, these kind of issues. So one of the central questions that remains for the party in the present times is how do you or how does the party remain retain its central authority and status in the life so the people even as its role from the day-to-day affair continues to retreat rapidly. Uh, and that is what the entire exercise has been. And some of the statistics about the Chinese Communist Party are obviously staggering. It is the only single party regime in the top 10 world economies. It is the only, uh, uh, it governs the largest population that any country has in the world, second largest economy in the world, and one of the largest armed forces with the highest defense budgets. Oddly enough, it's also the last 5 single party regimes, and its company is not exactly glorious as of now. The other 4 being DPRK, Lao PDR, Cuba, and Vietnam, which are majorly single party regimes, as argued by Kerry Brown in his one of his works. So how did party survive? How did the Chinese Communist Party survive the collapse of the Soviet Union? And how does the Chinese Communist Party survive various projections that hundreds and hundreds of people have made that the party is about to collapse, and that the party will collapse after 1989, the party will collapse under globalization, the party will collapse after uh, uh, after slowdowns or after one crisis or the other. It has not collapsed, but it remains strong. One of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party does not collapse, and I believe that it's a false assumption that Xi Jinping's leadership position is weakening or he's getting challenged or there are swords out to get Xi Jinping's post, etc. These are false premises on which we are just comforting ourselves. Party survives because party studies abroad. Party studies what is happening abroad and it learns lessons from its from the democratic countries as well. For example, one of the least known issues of cooperation between China and India was a Chinese Communist Party sent a delegation to India sometime about 2009-10, and then they studied the land compensation policy in India. And I'm not claiming that they sent only to India, but they sent to many other countries also, but they did that kind of policy change. So a land grab and a lack of compensation for land was one of the biggest issues that was highlighted. You would have seen that horseshoe house or those kind of images coming from China in about 2010-11. So the point is, China learns from other countries, and then they bring those changes in the way it governs and in the way it relates to its own people. So the legitimacy question, power, authority, and legitimacy question in the post-ideological era is, and how does the party look at these questions? If we untangle those messages from China, then to understand the party is relatively easy. I mean, you only have to follow a set of news messages and speeches for a while, and then they began to unravel themselves. They're not as mysterious as we begin to think from the beginning. So one of the significant professors from Tsinghua University is also one of the contributors. Okay, I'll stop within next 5 minutes so that we have half an hour for discussion. So I was talking of this contributor, Professor Hu Angang, says that Xi Jinping has focused on 6 different strategies for economic, for his leadership. First being people-centered development, so quality of life issues. Second is innovation-based development. So Made in China 2025 is about that. The third is green development. A lot of environmental changes are happening. A lot of policy changes are happening. A lot of coordination-driven development. A lot of issues of ministries not talking to each other do exist in China, or did exist in China, and Xi Jinping regime has tried to focus on that. So again, this message is not unique. This has been followed from the Hu Jintao thought of something called scientific development concept, and that is the basis on which they have continued to focus on that message. One of the significant thing that that is useful for party to rule is to, like I mentioned, avoid large scale unrest within the country. So what one thing that they have done is that its domestic security budget has increased substantially since the Xinjiang and Tibet riots 2008-9 onwards. So since 2011, the domestic security budgets have exceeded the national security budgets. Their police are now being trained at the level of paramilitary. Uh, we also know that China is a surveillance state. I mean, the way China controlled uh, the coronavirus was also on the basis of surveillance itself. Uh, and this anecdote I try to share all the time with like when I speak on China or on the party. Uh, all the roads in Beijing, all the tarred roads in Beijing are now under the coverage of CCTV networks. Uh, on top of that, the party uses facial recognition techniques of the most advanced nature that there can be, and on that basis itself, uh, it uh, it avoids people being able to uh, undertake large forms of gathering or communication that they might think is detrimental to their own interest. Uh, the anti-corruption campaign itself has been uh, significant. In the 19 party Congress, the word anti-corruption appeared on 20 occasions, and the discipline of the party cadre appeared on about 15 occasions. Uh, and that messaging actually followed from what Hu Jintao said, unswervingly combating corruption and preserving the integrity of the party. So the process is central overall. And the process matters actually for the party. And that is what they have been doing significantly. China uses this surveillance techniques to control its population in minority provinces as well. So for example, if you're a Uyghur Muslim in one city of Xinjiang, you are not able to enter a mosque in another city within your own province. Uh, every Uyghur has to have the government approved apps in their phones, and they have to scan those apps before entering a public place in a new city or in any city. And if you are not a local resident, you are not allowed to enter those places of prayer. Uh, that's because they think party always is always anticipating the next 1989, not only in Xinjiang but also in Tibet, but also amongst its own population. That's why it is always trying to work around uh, these issues. One of the significant issues that has been getting attention is whether or not Xi Jinping is going to be a president for life. And I'm of the opinion that that does not look likely the case. And for that, you have to go back to the Bolshevik crisis. Actually, we can speak for another couple of hours to look at the bargaining, etc., that happens for moving the hierarchy of the standing committee to the Politburo, from the Politburo uh, standing committee, etc., and the bargaining for that post. China has this huge number of leaders right now who have who came back to political activity after the Cultural Revolution, and they're all in their 60s. They have all have done the hard work, and they all have to be accommodated in some form or the other. They all have been successful in achieving China's economic growth, in organizing the Beijing Olympics, uh, and in managing the Taiwan issue or looking after North Korea. If you look at these 30 odd Politburo members, uh, so the rise that process is quite steep. So Xi Jinping obviously has tried to control the factions, the factional competition between the party, and tried to control the who gets in at what point in time, and to rather avoid the fights in that process in order that the party continues to present a unified face. Issue like Boshilai doesn't happen. Boshilai at some point mm, uh, gave a public interview uh, when Xi Jinping was already the uh, vice president, and said that uh, and had criticized him for growing uh, mm, under the tutelage of his father's name rather than his own achievements. They don't want, and that quote had became famous in the Chinese media, and abroad also it became uh, quite famous. So I'll end up talk by looking at a theory question. We all know Max Weber's idea of legitimacy, of legitimate authority. Uh, there's a traditional authority which is kings, kingdoms, princesses and prince, etc. This charismatic authority, obviously Mao Zedong had that kind of authority. And the third is rational legal authority. There's a perception that Chinese Communist Party has tried to move towards a rational legal authority step in its leadership uh, by trying to move towards performance-based legitimacy. But many believe that Xi Jinping is trying to reverse that process towards the charismatic uh, authority kind of step. But right now he has no option but to go back to the rational legal process, because he has only had compounding challenges on his uh, table. China has its hands full in Hong Kong crisis, in its debates with the Trump regime in the US, the slowdown domestically, and the biggest challenge obviously being the handling of the coronavirus. Uh, so these become some of the significant challenges for the Communist Party. Uh, they will try to present a unified message of socialist market economy and party centrality. And I'll end up, let me end actually right now by stating a simple fact that China had about 400 museums in 1978. In 2018, China has 5,000, had crossed the number of 5,000. Even in tier 3 cities, there are museums of that nature. Uh, each museum has a familiar, similar pattern. So most of the artifacts are replicas and recreations. They show that there was a rich heritage, a happy village kind of a story. And then they show that there's a graphic representation, cries of war and children and women shouting, uh, the country falling under the imperial and colonial invasions. And then there's liberation and re-emergence under the leadership of the party. If you look at this message of these museums, museums is a way of telling people that we are what we are for you, and you continue to follow us because we will bring you prosperity. Question us, ask questions, but don't challenge. And that is how the Chinese Communist Party will continue to work. I'm sorry I have exceeded my time, but let's hope we have some discussion in the next half an hour. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Avinash. I think you did cover the party from its history to the present one, where I think it's given us a very good broad overview uh, of what the party is about and how it plays a big part in how China sees itself in the world. Uh, if it's all right, I'd like to start the Q&A session. We do have a few questions, so because we do have some time at hand, I'd like to unmute the participants and keep it as a lively discussion. I'll start with Sachin, who has the first question. He has two, Sachin Kalbag. So I'm going to unmute you, Sachin, and you can ask the question directly to Avinash. Uh,
Oh, I
Sachin?
just saw the chat. The question I think is available.
Yeah, no, I
Hello.
just thought he can ask it directly to you. That's why. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So my question was about the Tiananmen Square incident and how it has changed China's modern history, its the country's psyche as a whole, how it has impacted its domestic policy and its foreign policy, especially with its neighbors, given the the hostile, I mean, the way China views it, the hostile conditions in which it operates in, whether it is Taiwan, whether it is the Uyghur population within the country, uh, the Vietnam challenge, the Indian challenge, its relationships with Nepal and Myanmar, and North Korea specifically. How do you think that incident pivoted uh, China's thinking, not only as a party, but as a country as a whole with respect to domestic and foreign policy?
Yeah, so I covered this in the point that the 3 points that I mentioned, that keeping the unified face of the party and not taking the fight outside uh, was important. At that time, the 1989 protests and at that time the party was divided on whether to become more democratic, more liberal in economic ways, or go back to the ways of communism, the old guard versus the new reformers. And the leader Hu Yaobang and others, Zhao Jiang, etc., they were kind of writing in a way that was inspiring the students' protest of that time. And Hu Yaobang's death actually inspired the Beijing protest to unravel. And he was one of the significant leaders of the party at that time. So that's when, after that, the organization's department and the propaganda department, their agenda became bigger. So now if you look at Chinese Communist Party's messaging, it is quite unified. So if you spend about 3 days in Beijing and you visit 5 universities and think tanks, by the end of it, you start to believe that in the meetings, they're all saying the same thing, because they are issued actually, I believe, on a quarterly basis or on a bi-monthly basis, a kind of a pink paper or a summary that goes out to them through their offices. It's not a secret anymore. And on the basis of those papers and those summary points, they speak on what they speak. A Chinese think tank person will never tell you the truth in the meetings or in the first interaction as well, but they'll always tell you a different story outside of these interactions at the end of the day, maybe on one-on-one basis. So the point is, keeping the unified face of the party goes to the bottom of the structure as well. So the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the CAS, is one of these principal think tanks in China. All of their researchers, about 5,000 of them researchers, about 2,000 economists among them, sociologists, IR thinkers, media experts, they're all looking at the world, but their boss is appointed by the party. So in China, in Mao era, there was a term of a conflict between expertise versus red. So right now, expertise is still controlled by the party, the red actually. And that is the unified messaging is how they have controlled the process after Tiananmen Square. To the people, there was the protesters in Tiananmen Square were the ones who had lost the social security, lifetime jobs, and jobs out of college, that kind of structure. And then they were not getting the jobs in new economy. There was not a globalized production chains in China at that point of time, etc. So the messaging for them was clear. The 1992 Deng Xiaoping Southern Tour that happened was actually telling the people that perform or perish, bring prosperity to the people, and that is how they have worked continuously, making people rich and telling them that that is where your job is, that is where your welfare is, in staying on the side of the party. Uh, and it has worked. So the assumption that also one of the assumptions that Chinese people are tired of the Chinese Communist Party and waiting to revolt is also a non-starter actually. There are some writers on democracy and other issues, but it's not a state or a society waiting to rebel against the party. I mean, you cannot become the second largest economy on the basis of people who are starting with a torch in their left hand. For their foreign policy, actually, after Tiananmen Square, none of the neighbors of China criticized China on human rights basis after Tiananmen Square. The last time US also majorly criticized China on Tiananmen Square and other instances was in 1993. 1994, I mean, publicly, Bill Clinton, in first 2 years of his tenure, criticized China on human rights. 1994, Boeing was to start its first assembly and production equipment facility in China. And that messaging was clear. If you want business with us of that nature, keep human rights away. So that has not happened. So they have shut people's mouth on the basis of money. And that is the long and short answers of that.
Perfect. Thank you, Avinash. I'd like to unmute Shravan. He has a question, and then I'll be unmuting Moira. So, Shravan, first you. Okay, there is some issue at his end, so I'll just ask the question myself. Uh, okay, so how's the leadership of the party structured in terms of geography and race composition? Does it impact the party's policy and thinking?
Race structure, it's in terms of geography, it's kind of difficult to say because people have this generation of leadership, the fifth and sixth generation of leadership, they have had their careers disturbed, and Chinese have traveled across their country for education and on their jobs as well. Obviously, China's ethnic composition is 92% Han Chinese, the Chinese as we know, and then there are rest of it, about 8% minorities, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Mongolians, and the Hui Muslims in South Western China. So I believe that the leadership is also structured in a similar way. In terms of education, actually, there's quite similar framework even up to this fifth generation of leadership. So until the fourth and fifth generation of leadership, most of them, until the fourth generation rather, most of them were educated in Soviet engineering colleges and then Chinese engineering academies and institutions. So out of the 35 Politburo or structures, you will see that 28 are engineers, hydrology, electrical, and something of that nature, because that is a construction generation of China, the heavy industry, etc. Now in Politburo, you are beginning to see economists taking a significant role, bankers coming up in different postures, and then you see also political scientists not in a central leadership position, but as prominent theoreticians of the party. So that is something that is there. Most of the leaders of the Central Committee today have all served in rural China, if that matters, either in Tibet or in Xinjiang or in so one difficult tenure, one metropolis tenure like Beijing or Chongqing or something that nature, one ministry and one party office in the period before coming to the Central Committee.
Moira, can you please ask your question? I have unmuted you. Okay. Sorry, I think there is some issue at his end too. Okay, I will go to his question.
The second question by Sachin is actually significant. Crony capitalism in China and the billionaires in the party.
Sure, if you'd like to address that first, then definitely. And then
yeah, so corruption in the party actually, and the party millionaires and their wealth has been talked about a lot. And the anti-corruption campaign has also looked at not making a lot of money or keeping your money hidden well enough that it doesn't come in the attention of people's in people's attention. So one of the famous cases was of the secretary of Hu Jintao. I'm forgetting his name, but his the secretary's son crashed his Ferrari in Beijing about 5 years ago, and along with him in that car also were two girls. There was drugs involved and other things involved. So that became a kind of a face of cronyism and corruption in China, that you advocate simplicity to outsiders, but you make a lot of money. A lot of this corruption also happens in terms of real estate in Hong Kong, actually. Real estate in Hong Kong, shoppings, and cruise tours and things like that. A lot of corruption also happened in terms of army appointments, by the way, at higher levels. One of the biggest corruption cases of an army major general was someone responsible uh, for construction of army accommodation, and he had himself uh, achieved some penthouse kind of accommodations in upmarket Hong Kong, and you can imagine how much money he would have made. So that affects the party. Uh, the the new billionaires, China started admitting them as party members sometime after 2005, but they do not. They become members of the party just for the sake of keeping the party on their side. If you have to get business in China, you have to speak with the party office first, and then the ministry later. That's why they became members, and that's why they have their own interests. Otherwise, all of these Chinese leaders, sons and daughters, I would imagine the top 100 leaders, their sons and daughters are studying in Ivy League universities on funded seats. So that is the extent of money that everyone makes. So you make money, uh, be corrupt, but don't challenge the present day leadership. That is how they continue to work.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll just ask Moira's question and then I'll ask Charumati's question. So first question is,
Hello.
yeah, hi, I think Moira can
Hi.
speak. Yeah, Moira, please go ahead.
Yes. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Given that the Chinese Communist Party values stability at all costs, is this the general context or prism by which we view or analyze their policies, actions, or reactions to global issues? Or there are also other factors that we need to look out for when trying to understand how the party engages the rest of the world?
You mean stability at home and the foreign relations impact, or?
Yes.
Uh, yeah, so stability at home is achieved by creating prosperity and by creating more stakeholders in prosperity. I mean, Americans have practically given a lot of technology and knowledge and resource and know-how to China in the last 40 odd years, with the including military technology transfers until mid 1980s, believing that China will become normal at some point in time, and China has used that opportunities at all the time. Stability. What happens after stability? Beyond stability, the power and status also matters for the party, and how do you showcase your status? I mean, one of the biggest showcases for China to one of the biggest example for China to showcase its status was the 2008 Olympics, and the way they organized it, but also uh, topped the medal tally in that Olympics. So that status also matters. So you have your power, you have your legitimacy in the eyes of the people, and friendly issues, relations abroad, but also you need recognition and status, and that is what the party and Chinese government has tried to pursue by. You all recall that they have pursued creation of the Confucius Institutes in the last 7 or 8 years. They are going down significantly now in numbers and quality. But creation of soft power globally is something that they are trying to pursue in order to achieve better status abroad. So there are achievements to be made beyond stability. I think stability is something that will remain a foundational issue, but then the next are issues of quality, status and recognition. That's what matters for them.
Perfect. I'll just ask Charumati's question. Could you tell us a bit more about China's relationship with the Western media? And I think it follows up well with Moira's question, especially in context of shaping the narratives around COVID-19.
Well, China's relations with Western media and some of the recent stories, if you have seen, and they're not unsurprising, that they allowed Western media to operate from, they allow Western media to operate from China until the media revenge strategy began with US by expelling journalists, the Huawei case narrative and coverage, etc., and the New York Times journalist coverages, etc. There is a slightly different story about Western media outlet. I mean, Western media outlets is not a unified story. American versus European media is also there. A lot of European media, newspapers, Chinese are buying editorial full pages that that glossify Belt and Road Initiative and that glossify other achievements of China or the swift action on coronavirus, for that matter. They also had an extensive media scholarships framework with some of the American media houses. But right now that relation is under a lot of strain actually in the last 1 year, not even 1 year, like 6 to 7 months, with expelling of a lot of journalists from China and from the US. So it's a developing story and something that needs to be watched. But there's even more that the propaganda department of China has. There was a recent story that they have made substantial donations to media houses in US, including Washington Post, including a couple of newspapers in Australia, research and story grants or something of that nature. So what are the sources of that, and what is the follow-up? That also is an interesting issue to look after actually in the days to come.
I think Aditya has a question related to what is the CCP's approach and policy on climate change and environment, and does it actually take these issues seriously? Especially, I think, in the context of what you spoke about, the pollution levels rising in China. I think that would be a good point to address.
Yeah, so they, I mean, I did a research paper on that in India Quarterly about 3 years ago, and they took a lot of advantage in that, in a good way, of the Obama regime also. Obama accommodated China a lot, and the Paris Climate Accord was something where China emerged as a maker of the accord, compared to the previous processes where China was seen as a disruptor. So I mentioned the point of status. The public criticism of China on the basis of climate change, the biggest polluter, biggest user of coal, etc., are also status points, and they have tried to address those concerns by taking the G2 agreement seriously. So clean coal came to China I mean, better technologies were supposed to come to China from US in that phase. Once again, technologies went to China instead of India at that point of time, for the sake of saving the global partnership. They also got a lot of the pollution control and pollution standard benchmarking and measurement cooperation with the American industries also at that time. So they began to see like Paris Climate Accord was one of the achievements of the G2 framework as well, and they took that seriously at that point. They also, as they move towards the next step of production, the Made in China 2025, and improving China's role in value-added chain overall, that is where the environment is being taken seriously. There are villages in China which began to be called as cancer villages actually, because the number of deaths in those villages because of cancer rose from 1 in 1,000 to about 18 in 1,000 in about 10 years. And these are all downstream villages, where on upstream there are paper mills or leather factories, fashion industry related businesses, or even rare earth elements processing units. So that is something that will take them longer to change. But urban environmental issues is something that they are working on seriously. Now the Beijing Environmental Action Plan is also expanded to the Tri-City area. the Beijing Tianjin Hubei province. Imagine that as like an NCR framework compared to Delhi, expanding the same benchmarking as far as in the context of Delhi, Bhiwadi and Gurgaon, and extended Noida for that matter. So they are working on that for Beijing, and clean transportation and solar based and battery operated cars is something that they have subsidized quite heavily. So for example, they have achieved 20% of the cars sold in China in 2018 and 19 have been electric cars, actually, something that is significant to note. And I think about 40% of their cities have now achieved all electric bus framework, electric bus fleet. So that is something also that they have been doing. So that is, they have achieved by benefiting from globalization. So the BYD case study, if you have seen, if you followed, it also operates those buses in Hyderabad and Pune now after producing in India. And I think also few in Mumbai and Delhi besides other locations. BYD is a classic example of globalization. It has investments from Germany, UK, Taiwan, and also I think Korea, and it's made in Guangzhou, the research and innovation. So that is how they have benefited from that research and innovation structure on environment and climate change also.
Okay, so last two questions, Avinash. Second last is by Prashant Kanpal. It's regarding the Uyghurs. So there are concerns have been raised many times in international communities, but we haven't seen such concerns from Islamic terror outfits. Though we know that ETIM has good ties with Al-Qaeda, Taliban, but their activities are kind of limited currently in mainland. With increasing Uyghur exploitation and surveillance level, what can be the future dimension of terrorism in the region?
Oh, this can be a long session actually on Xinjiang actually. 1.5 years ago, the Saudi Crown Prince went to China actually. Okay, I'm also getting one private question from Professor Avinash Nayak, so I'll handle it after this if you agree. So Uyghurs question has actually, China benefited a lot from the global war on terrorism. That is where they upgraded the security framework in Xinjiang. Compared to Tibet question, Tibet became a human rights question and a diversity question. But Xinjiang did not remain that kind of question because of the incidents of terrorism in that part of the world. So that China benefited greatly from that. They implemented surveillance. Part of the reason why the China-Pakistan economic corridor exists, and I think that will be discussed when you have that discussion next year, is also with the concerns in Xinjiang actually. By being able to better watch the movement between Xinjiang and Pakistan. The unregulated movement between Xinjiang and Pakistan in the 1980s was the reason why terrorism came to Xinjiang in the first place. So they have cut off those networks with the rest of the world. But if Saudi Arabia is not going to criticize what China is doing in Xinjiang, then no one else will, because money is what matters. China is the biggest buyer of oil, and that will remain for many years to come. So no one is going to talk about it. The future of separatism and terrorism in the region, it's very difficult to look at it. But I don't think the Xinjiang issue is settled as of now. They have a lot of underground networking, and I'm talking this from open media sources also. They have a lot of networking in Europe, and I don't think the issue is settled in a conclusive manner as of now. So let's okay, I have one question. This question, okay, from Avinash Nayak. Let me just read this one. Would you like to raise this question, Professor Nayak, on microphone for everyone's benefit?
Yes, sir. Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
Good morning, sir.
Yes.
Sir, actually, my question is, we had a better bilateral relationship with China than any country all over the world. And the bilateral relationship was regarding urban development, then infrastructure development, then medical facilities, and other aspects of foreign direct investment. But how the relationship is going to be deteriorated and why China is behaving like this in a brutal manner?
It's
And second is the second question is regarding what is the basic provocation which led to China to be more provocative, whether it is some sorts of spyness or it is due to its adventurism or some sorts of political or ideological radicalism or polarism.
Okay, thank you, Avinash. Avinash, actually, like we discussed at the start, if you can briefly address this question, because we're looking at more at the CCP angle of it.
Because
So,
what is the instant cause behind this?
Like I said, Avinash, sir, the whole idea of this talk was to have a much more overview of the CCP and not address the current issue. But I think Professor Godbole will touch on it briefly because we have short on time and we have one more question coming up last. So that's I've kept Shreyas waiting for a very long time.
And you also sir,
Sir,
you
please,
also sir told about the poverty and inequality.
sir,
So what
if
is
we
the
can, sir, please,
what
if
is
we can,
the degree of poverty and how China addresses it?
Yeah.
So these are the three questions I asked, and if
sir,
you can share something for
I'm
us.
just sharing a link for everyone's benefit in the chat room
Sir.
of the recent article of a Chinese perspective on the India-China border issue. I think it's quite there's quite a lot of this is a dense article. There's a lot of information on why China might have done that it might have done. But on India-China border issue, it's a hot topic. It's a present ongoing topic, and I know exactly the same thing that as everyone else knows right now. I don't have any access to private information, so there's no reason for me to repeat anything that's in the public domain at this point in time. Unfortunate as it is, I can be honest with the audience that I have been fairly disturbed for the last 4 days after these incidents. I could not sleep for the first 2 days, actually. I mean, having studied China for last 16 years, when no one is ready for such kind of issue, and a lot of assumptions that of looking at India-China relations have been washed aside by what happened in those 2 days in India-China border. So a lot of it will change, but it's still a very new topic. So let's not get into it. The poverty issue, China has controlled its poverty, and as part of the 200-year plans, China wants to eliminate poverty by next year when the party becomes 100 years old, and wants to become a fully middle-class society and advanced socialist market economy by the time China becomes 100 years old in 2049. I think they're on track to eliminate poverty as of now. I'm saying as of now means as of before the coronavirus and as of before the economic slowdown. I don't have an updated information in the last 1 year exactly what has been the case. So they have done quite impressive on poverty elimination, and that is something that we need to do urgently by creating prosperity and by spreading prosperity across the country and the society.
Perfect. Thank you, Avinash. And the last question, I'm going to give it to Shreyas because I've made her wait for a very long time. So my co-host has the last word for the questions, and then we'll close for the day. Shreyas, it's yours.
Thank you, Godbole. Thank you, Avinash. I think you have answered most of my questions already right now. But I have a simple question. How do you see the future of CCP? Because I'm asking this question from the background that there is a general understanding about the intentions of China to replace US. It's a simple power politics in the international relations. But does CCP has ability to create such tractions like Communist Party and Soviet Union did at the time of Cold War? Does it has a ideological attraction like it has at the time of Soviet Union, or the governance model or the economic model? Mostly the economic model is more popular about China than the governance and the ideological. So your views on that. That's it. Thank you.
Have no doubts that China wants to replace US as the hegemon of the world. I mean, I never had this doubt that their ultimate goal is trying to become number one in the world, and they will continue to work in that direction. And I think they have rather appeared to be on that path about 2 years ago. Can they achieve that now? Their messaging has been economic, and then there was only one small reference in the 19-party Congress about the China model and the possibility of exporting that China model abroad. But we did not see a repeat of that actually later on, because that message would have been followed in the third plenum and the fourth plenum if they were going to pursue that ideologically. But there was an immediate backlash, I think, domestically as well, that you're reaching out too much, and there's a lot of criticism. The public memory of 1989 has not gone away, as of the rest of the issues. So the China model issue of governance has been retracted to a certain extent, but economic model of investment and the idea of Sinocentrism, China becoming the core and everyone else becoming the feeder of that economic model, is something that they will pursue continuously. And actually, most of the world is beginning to react to that already. The South Koreans have begun to react. Looking at the example of what's happening to South Korea, the Japanese have announced the policy of diversifying their investments abroad. So this clash will continue between the US, between the Chinese model ultimately and the US model. But it's difficult. I mean, it's too much of crystal glazing to say whether the party, if the party will break down. I think there are a few scholars, I will not name them, they have built their career by writing these articles that 2010 is coming, 2020 is coming, and 2025 is coming, but there's no point looking at false optimisms.
Perfect. I think, Avinash, you've been a great speaker, and I think all of us really, at least I speak for myself, and I'm sure everyone did really benefit from great insights from you. We can see that you know this topic very intimately, and it's amazing to hear your views. Thank you, everyone, for joining in today. A lot of you have been joining us regularly, waking up on a Saturday morning. So we hope to see you next week too, where we are going to have a more broader view on this topic, looking at China's regional involvement, especially taking the CCPE, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, as one of the examples. And we'll have Kalol Bhattacharjee, who's an author on this topic, who's written books on this, and who's a journalist. So definitely do join us next Saturday for this topic. And thank you everyone for joining. And Avinash, thank you especially to you for being such a great speaker.
Thank you very much.